right, our next topic, we're going to talk about other considerations. Camera considerations, other post considerations. It's really important to forensically know where your footage came from when it comes time to do proper color management. If your post house bakes in an IDT, or they bake in a conversion, or they linearize the footage, you need, as a compositor, as a shop, you need to know that. Mistakes happen all the time. I mean, I've worked on stuff where an episode of a show, we'd been working in one flavor of RE wide, and we got an episode that got pulled with different settings, and ultimately what happened is they baked in they linearized, they went from camera native to linear sRGB, but they used the wrong IDT. They used a RE, wide gamut 3 instead of wide gamut 4. So not only did we have pulls that were just fundamentally look different than the episode before, they were also incorrectly generated. So, we talk about transfer, we can use a color matrix to go from one gamut to another. And in this case, what we wound up having to do, because the solution given to us instead of new pulls was they just sent us a 3x3 matrix to convert back to camera native gamut. The problem for us is this problem didn't get caught until work was already commenced, and now we had a bunch of comps that were generally set, and converting our plates back to the camera native space was, a huge time suck for us. And the solution was, just put this 3x3 matrix in your dailies generation, and then it'll just make the quick times correct, and then we'll fix it, when it hits post. Well, that's cool, but when we comp things, we need our gamuts to match. And like, we had screen burns, and now if we comp the screen burns in the way we'd comp them in previous episodes, we would have created a mismatch in our gamuts. So while it would have looked okay on our end, as soon as they actually apply the fix back in the online, it's going to now make the gamuts of the devices wrong. So we had to actually jump through some hoops and put our burn-ins into the wrong gamut that matched the wrong gamut that our plates were in, so that when they were corrected, everything got corrected to the correct space, both for the camera native stuff and for things that came from our graphics team. And yeah, that's, the time saved and just the errors, it's really important to understand where things come from. And that's, that's throughout. It starts on set. It starts with the camera. ISO, knowing the ISO, knowing the biases for some of these wide gamut cameras. A lot of them shoot hot. They'll crank they're so good at, they have so much dynamic range, they will expose foreshadows and they'll blow all the skies out because the sensor can handle it. Knowing that can help you kind of control those and bring those back down. Similarly with white balance, white balance, academically, white balance should just be whatever white is in that scene. Unfortunately, more and more I'm seeing it where white balance is used as a creative tool to set the look, instead of using CDLs. And for us, that's a problem, because what happens is, like, you'll shoot a green screen that's maybe daylight lit, or lit with HMIs or outside in the sun, but then it gets shot with a tungsten white balance, and now that green has turned more into blue-green. And if you don't know, artists will just go to work on that, trying to get that key to work, and it's like, it just doesn't really want to key right. Similarly, I've seen blue screens that are shot with a really low K point. Like the room was lit, for daylight, but they shot it with a, 3200 white point. And that blue screen that was in that scene has now, when you apply that, you warm it up, that blue screen basically goes gray-brown. And same deal, it just won't pull. Artists are in there rotoing hairs, and it's like, no, stop. Take a step back. Like, we know that is a blue screen. We know that it is blue. So why does it not look blue on our screen? And in some cases they're actually using CDLs to correct it, which is even more problematic, because if you use a shot LUT, show LUT workflow where you're looking through those client LUTs in your viewer, that blue might look okay, but at the working space level, that blue isn't really blue. That blue is gray. And then the CDL is actually putting the blue back into it, or the LUT is putting the blue back into it, or doing a gamut conversion. That happens a lot, where show LUTs are actually applying a gamut transform. And so things look right when the show LUT is applied, but in a normal like sRGB viewer process, everything looks a little desaturated or a little shifted. And it's because that gamut transform's happening in the wrong spot, at least from a working space standpoint. And that's something I always work to, is like, let's get it right. Let's know what it is going in, so that we're getting the proper conversion from our camera native space to our working space. And then if we need to go back to camera native space before applying the show LUT, that's what we do. Instead of keeping it in native space, working it incorrectly, and then not having to do that second transform. But no, it's really important to understand from a forensic standpoint, what it was shot as. Because we do see that. We see creative choices being made with things that shouldn't be, in the wrong place. And it happens with CDLs too. I've seen sequences come in where, say it was a really dark scene with a blue screen behind it, and they had to light the blue screen strong enough to, make it pop. But in doing so, it basically cast blue spill over the entire set. So instead of everybody just living with that, they went and they cranked the blue out with the CDL. Similar problem if you look at things through the client color stack, through the CDL, through the show LUT. Now everything looks okay, and an artist would go and they desaturate it. They pull their D-spills in and they're looking at it. No, it looks okay. Well, they're not looking at it in a proper pipeline. When you actually look at it without show LUTs, without CDLs applied, they didn't get nearly all the spill because the CDL was doing the spill removal. And it hits the online, and then you get people yelling about, why is there blue spill everywhere? And it's an issue of order, and how they were just looking at it in the wrong place and not checking it in a couple other ways. And, it's also really important. Look at things through client LUTs, look at them through the proper display process. Look at them through the tone map display processes. It will generally make things better. Here's an example. Like, you can have flat yellow footage that the show LUT and CDL make look, nice and clean. So like if you went to key this blue, it's going to key very differently than what you're seeing on the screen. If you went to spill suppress it, it's going to spill suppress differently than you think. And I've seen it both ways, where you have really warm stuff cooled off to look better, and you have really cool stuff warmed up to look better. So it's important. It's important to know the source. It's important to look at it in a proper managed system. Similarly, like, it's important to understand the process. Like, this is a real high level, like, steps things go through, but usually you start with your input in client native space, and that's either linear camera native or log camera native. You're setting your read IDTs or an OCIO transform, or you're defining the native space, and you're pushing that native space into a working space. Working space, again, typically ACES CG, but you can define working space however you want. Sometimes it might be more functional to use linear sRGB. Sometimes you might want to stay camera native if you have really bright colors and neons, and clipping is a constant concern. But basically, you're working in that working space, and then you use an ODT to go from working space to your display space. And so now you've got your artist display where you're seeing it properly piped through, where a green screen ought to look green. It ought to look like you're standing there on the day. And you also have your client transform group, where typically you're going from your working space back to camera native log. Then you're applying CDLs because you're replicating the work, you're replicating the pipeline that was used to create the dailies, which is usually from camera native log. So you're applying CDL, then you're applying the showlet, which has its own gamut conversion typically. Most shows, they're either going to ACES, or most of them I see go to Rec 709. So it's a Rec 709 showlet. You can't just look at, you can take that output and just look at it on an sRGB screen, but that's not necessarily correct either. But by knowing what it is, you know that the output of your showlet is Rec 709. You can specify that, convert back to working space, and then working space back to display space. So now you're looking at something that's going to look very, very close to what your client is going to see on their Rec 709 monitor. And so that's your display space. When it comes time to render, you're unless there's a different spec, whatever you did to get the image into comp working space, you use to get out. And it's not, I like to think of ODTs as, this is a little older, but it's usually the inverse of your IDT. And similarly, you use pretty much the same stack you created to create your client display, you use to create your client QuickTimes, where you're going into that client color transform group, where you're going back to native log, CDLs, showlets. There you're just leaving it in the native space that the showlet, back to the showlet space, which again is typically Rec 709, but sometimes I've seen ACES as well. And so now you've got a QuickTime in Rec, and you've got client native space, camera native space deliverables. So that pretty much wraps up other considerations. Again, I can't emphasize enough like the forensics of it, like knowing what steps the imagery came through to get to you will help you greatly in knowing what it is and knowing how to operate with it.